Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Bonnie, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And I'll try to get you back on schedule here, Bonnie. I definitely understand the struggle of trying to keep things on time. But basically, what I want to do today is just give a quick overview of where we stand for human exploration, how the architecture is developing now. So some of you may know this very well. I know some of you are intimately involved, and some of you maybe not so much. So I just want to highlight where we are, what we're doing, and try to point out a few places where I think there may be some opportunities that may be relevant to the SBAG community. So, okay, well, I'm going to keep going, but just cut in if it looks bad or I sound bad or whatever. But thanks, Paul. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go into great detail on any of this, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. But I do want to just kind of highlight where we stand right now. So we're developing a series of key elements that will enable human exploration to move beyond low Earth orbit into exploring deep space and the lunar surface, and then planning for moving forward to Mars. So kind of the key elements are shown here. We have the travel elements, which are the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft, which is the crew-capable capsule. And those vehicles will help get us off the Earth, out of low Earth orbit, put us into various orbits around the Moon, where we're also going to be working on building the gateway in lunar orbit. So this will be a platform that the Orion can dock with, so our crew members can go and have a platform in a lunar orbit that will then enable rendezvous with another element, the human landing system, which is designed to be basically a ferry to get astronauts from lunar orbits to lunar surface and back up to lunar orbit. So you got your SLS and Orion to get from Earth to a lunar orbit. You have a gateway in lunar orbit, and then you have a human landing system that can take you from a lunar orbit to the Moon. All while we're doing this, on the HEO side, on SMD side, they're working on the commercial lunar payload services, or CLPS. And so these are basically commercial opportunities to land on the lunar surface carrying payloads. So again, kind of the big thing that we're doing here is really starting to work more closely with the commercial community. And CLPS is kind of our biggest first step on that front. So there are a number of groups or companies that are vying for contracts now for landings. SMD is committed to 2 landings per year, one to a global location and one to a polar location, which matches up with the destination for the Artemis astronauts, which is the South Polar region of the Moon. Now, if you look at all of this together, that gets us to the Moon, but eventually down in the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner, we're going to start looking at building up assets in a particular region on the South Pole of the Moon. So we'll start delivering mobility assets, vehicles, surface habitats, elements like that to establish a base camp, which kind of gives us a toehold on the lunar surface. And so that's kind of the Artemis snapshot, and we'll go through in a little more detail. I did want to just show this slide, as Artemis 1 has been mentioned a few times already this morning because of some of the opportunities that it's bringing more broadly to the NASA community. This just is our we call it the check chart. It's showing our progress as we move along. If any of you were present for the NASA headquarters presentations at LPSC, almost at the exact same time we were conducting the Green Run hot fire test for the SLS engine stages. And that went well. So now I didn't have a green check in that box at LPSC, and we do have a green check in that box now. So we're still pushing forward for our soonest launch opportunity for Artemis 1 would be later this year. And I think Tom mentioned that as well earlier. So, just kind of showing some of those milestones, but what this does is it provides an opportunity not only for us to conduct a test flight of the Orion and begin to look at our Artemis systems, but we also look at what are some of the partnerships we can put in place. Many of you are, intimately involved in several of these, but these are what we provide with the SLS is some opportunity for secondary payloads. And I know I worked with NIA Scout before going to headquarters. That has obvious implications for the SBAG community. Argo Moon also has some overlap with a CubeSat that will participate in the DART mission. There are some lunar opportunities. Tom mentioned earlier some of the lunar opportunities. We have lunar flashlight, lunar ice cube. So a number of really interesting activities underway here as the secondary payloads on Artemis. But Artemis 1 will give us an opportunity to launch the Orion and put it out to the moon. So that's a non-crewed test flight of our crew-capable Orion capsule. We'll bring it back, and that will give us kind of that first check on how that hardware works. In addition to the CubeSats that can be launched along with SLS and then go on their way to conduct their own activities, we also have some activities going on inside the Orion capsule throughout. A lot of this is focused on making sure we understand as best as possible the environment within which our astronauts and our hardware will be expected to operate as we start conducting Artemis missions to the moon. So this is just an example of the activities we have, test activities on that first Artemis mission. Again, dosimeters, trying to understand exactly what our crew are going to be dealing with during those Artemis missions. Let's see here. There we go. I mentioned earlier the Gateway. So this is our spacecraft that will be in orbit around the moon, and it provides an opportunity for docking with both Orion and the Human Landing System. So along with the Gateway, while it's in orbit around the moon, there will be opportunities for research. And we have actually identified and selected 2 payloads for early launch with some of the early elements on Gateway, and those are Ursa and Hermes. Again, with a focus on characterizing the space environment within which our astronauts will be expected to operate. The Ursa is a European Space Agency radiation instrument, and Hermes is a NASA-provided space weather instrument. Again, both working together to help characterize the environment. We'll also have some internal activities. ESA is also providing internal dosimeter array that will be able to characterize, in combination with Ursa and Hermes, we'll understand the radiation environment outside of the Gateway and then be able to characterize how similar or different that is after interacting with the Gateway itself. And this matches up with some of the hardware that flies on Orion in Artemis 1. Now, a point to make here is these are some of the early payloads that we identified to fly on Gateway. We've also been reviewing what are the highest priority science objectives that across the board might be of interest to SMD as well as our international partners. And just a note, one area that we have a good bit of interest in is understanding the dust environment around the Gateway. From an operations perspective, we're interested in understanding, is there dust that's coming back to the Gateway on board the HLS? And is it staying in orbit around the Gateway? Are we creating our own exosphere, basically? But the same type of opportunity would be present for understanding dust that the Gateway is interacting with from deep space that's not part of the lunar return from the HLS. So there's some opportunity there. So I would encourage the community to stay tuned to Gateway as it develops. Now, I mentioned we'll be bringing these elements to the lunar surface. Again, trying to get a toehold on the lunar surface by developing a base camp or a place that we can repeat visit. So a big part of what we talk about with Artemis, we use the word sustainability quite often. Sustainability, it turns out, it's one of those words that means a lot of different things to different communities depending on your perspective. But in general, what we're aiming for is being able to kind of reuse elements. So Apollo was a series of one-off sortie missions, and each mission had to bring everything it was going to use. What we're looking at here is how can we start to reuse some of that hardware. So if you can use it for several missions and extend your length of stay on the lunar surface or the amount of coverage you get on the lunar surface, that's what we're kind of looking at. So this really is a combination of Science Mission Directorate, Space Technology Mission Directorate, and what we're doing inside HEO. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we have a strategy for exploring the moon, getting that toehold. But a lot of what we're testing at the moon has links to what we will eventually hope to be doing when we send astronauts to Mars in the future. So this chart just kind of draws a link there. I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that we're going to go and only test a few items on the moon and then go to Mars. This is what it takes. This is the kind of hardware it takes to survive during deep space exploration. So if you want to spend longer times in space, cover more ground, whether it's Moon or Mars, other destinations, these are the types of technologies that we need to invest in. And I think there's probably a good bit of overlap here with what may be of interest to the SBAG community, understanding power, the power that we hope to generate to be able to do this type of work, mobility, telerobotic operations. How are we going to do fine dexterous teleops? I know that's areas that your community has put a good bit of effort to in the past. So a lot of that will be relevant here as we develop this architecture moving forward. I'll just real quickly go through these so we can get done. But the human landing system, I mentioned before, this is kind of our ferry from lunar orbit to the lunar surface. If you're paying attention to any of this, in April, we announced SpaceX as the winner for our option A. But we are currently in a blackout as we work our way through protests from the other companies that were competing. So stay tuned there. They're working through that right now, and there's not a whole lot we can say on that because we remain in blackout until that's finished. We're working our way through developing requirements for mobility capabilities. So an unpressurized rover is considered to be a very high value asset because one of the things we want to do is make sure our astronauts can do more than just walk around. We'd like them to be able to increase the distance that they can cover, increase the opportunity to find new samples, interact with diverse terrains. So the unpressurized rover is one of the early assets that would give us that capability. Ultimately, we would like to get to the point where we have a pressurized rover, so basically a roving habitat that can increase the range over which we move, as well as having a pressurized vehicle gives a little bit of a break to your crew. They're not on EVA basically the whole time that they're driving around. So that's one of the capabilities we're trying to work towards that would be relevant elsewhere as well. Another aspect I mentioned earlier, foundational habitat. So this would kind of be like your base camp, node of operations here. This would be kind of the main place where you're working from, and the habitat would kind of mark that base camp location. So you can have up to 2 to 4 crew, and you can start to consolidate required materials there, like medical equipment, maybe science, research equipment could be stored there. And it gives your crew kind of a base of operations as they're exploring the moon. Another aspect we're looking at that may have some relevance, and we're working this kind of in early formulation now, is the concept of a transit habitation. And so this is looking forward to Mars, trying to prepare for Mars, but it would give us an opportunity working with the Gateway to start looking at some of the shakedown missions that we would need to prep for that long trip to Mars. So as I mentioned, this is kind of in formulation, but there's the potential for this vehicle to depart from the Gateway on some missions that are not yet defined. So thinking about that, I know I've mentioned to this community in the past, the Gateway has potential options for maybe deploying CubeSats in the future. There's a logistics module that at some point will depart from the Gateway, could be potentially outfitted for science observations and go somewhere else that may be of interest to the SBAG community. Same thing with something like a transit habitat as we think about how to develop that in preparation for Mars. Where do we want to send this on some of these missions to prepare for that? And I think this just brings it back around to the picture for the base camp. But again, I just want to point out, as we move forward with the human architecture, our number one objective is getting our crew members to the moon. But what they do there is to conduct science. And as we develop that architecture for the moon and forward to Mars, the opportunities will exist to conduct research throughout the inner solar system potentially. So I think they're, long range thinking forward, start thinking about some of the opportunities that could be developed or might exist for this SBAG community. And I think there's a lot of trade space for conversation there moving forward. So Bonnie, with that, I will stop talking, and however you want to handle questions going into your discussion phase, I'll hang out here.
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions before we move on to the open mic. You could put them in the chat or raise your hand.
So I've got a very aggressive cat crawling around on me right now. So see,
it's okay. We like cats. Cats and kids are okay. Dogs too. Oh, look at
they're good.
An orange man. Yes.
Can we ask questions audio?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So I just had a question about the frequent mention. Sorry, the frequent mention of CubeSat and other deployments from the gateway. Do you have any idea how that, like when we might expect to start seeing that come up as something we could? I mean, what do we have to design to for that? It seems very sort of vague right now.
Yeah, it is vague because we're still very much in a formulation point for that. So that's certainly not a thing that's going to happen in any of the very early missions at Gateway as we're developing the Gateway itself. But it is a discussion point. It's a great starting point for a CubeSat mission, and the international partners are interested in that as well. And the question you just asked is exactly the question that we are asking and starting to discuss. Is this do you send a CubeSat launcher that is already equipped with CubeSats? Or do you, are you actually releasing them from the gateway similar to the way we do with the ISS? I don't have answers for that specifically other than to say we're asking the same questions you are. The biggest part though that also may be of interest to this community is we have to develop a strategy for how we track all of these things. The biggest concern is that with CubeSats would be we release a CubeSat and then it becomes orbital debris of some kind that we need to worry about striking the gateway or an HLS that's carrying crew, Orion, something else there. So there, before we probably are in a position to be conducting CubeSat missions from Gateway, we're going to have to think through how do we track what's in the lunar orbit itself. So that's another thing to think about that I think this community may be able to provide some strong input for.